All right, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. This webinar is co-hosted by the BC Climate Emergency Campaign and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, or CCPA. And I'm sure, as you all know, it's centered around a recent report titled Connecting BC, a 10-year vision for public transit throughout BC, which was a joint collaboration between Marc Lee from the CCPA and the BC Federation of Labour. My name is Emiko Newman. I'm the coordinator of the BC Climate Emergency Campaign, and I will be the MC for today. So we do have people joining us, I'm sure, from all across the province or even outside of BC. So we do encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat and let us know where you're calling in from, including whose lands you are on. And if you don't know whose lands you're on, there's an excellent website, nativeland.ca, that will be going right into the chat. I would encourage you to take a look at that and find out whose traditional territories you're living on. As for me, I'm joining this call from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Stolo, and Coquitlam First Nations. And I'm so grateful to have access to the beautiful ocean and the forest just steps away from where I am. Went for a nice, beautiful walk down to the water this morning and felt really reinvigorated. But I'm also thinking right now about the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion because oil just started flowing through it. And of course, that impacts Burrard Inlet. So I'm sure many of us on this call today are feeling the mental impact of that and carrying heavy hearts with us. And I think it's also created a sense of renewed urgency in this fight. And I also just wanted to mention how important it is that when we're having conversations about transportation solutions, just like with any climate discussions, how crucial it is that we're doing this through a justice-centered equity lens and prioritizing the needs of Indigenous communities who live not only in urban centers, but also rural and remote areas with very specific transportation needs. And also remembering that transportation solutions do have the potential to continue perpetuating harm and extractivism. This report that we'll be talking about today, though, does a really fantastic job of centering Indigenous communities and leadership in developing transit solutions, as well as the needs of women and gender diverse folks and racialized workers and people with disabilities. And I'm really excited to be hearing more from Marc Lee, who is the author of the report, as I mentioned, and will be walking us through the plan and some of the highlights. I'm sure many of you know Marc, but if you don't, he's a senior economist with the BC office of the CCPA, where he started working in 1998. And he's one of Canada's leading progressive commentators on economic and social policy issues. Marc also led the CCPA's Climate Justice Project, which published a wide range of research on fair and effective approaches to climate action through integrating principles of social justice. And he continues to write about climate action, energy policy, strategies for affordable housing, federal and provincial budgets, and economic trends. I'm sure everyone here has come across his work in one way or another. And we'll also be hearing from Eric Doherty, who is a transportation planning consultant. He specializes in improving community health and accessibility and reducing climate pollution. And he's also the lead of the BC Climate Emergency Campaign's Transportation Working Group. In addition to hearing from Marc and Eric, we're also pleased to have a number of special guests joining us today, and they'll be sharing their personal testimonials. So I'll introduce them all individually right before they speak. We should have a few minutes at the end for questions, if all goes well, so please feel free to put those into the chat at any time, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. With that, we're going to be hearing from our first video testimonial from Sharon, who is with Let's Ride BC.
Good afternoon. My name is Sharon Kravitz, and I'm a member of Let's Ride, Make Public Transit BC-wide. We advocate for an accessible, sustainable, publicly owned and operated transit network throughout BC. In rural communities, the priority is not buses for vacations. It is the need for local people to get to critical medical appointments, or the need to go buy groceries without having to hitchhike. And of course, the need for safety. Here are some of the things we've been told. From the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, traditionally, transit services to First Nation communities have been, at best, infrequent and expensive. Communities with insufficient transportation services experience greater risks and limitations to meeting their needs. The Highway of Tears is one of several examples where insufficient transportation disproportionately exposed Indigenous women and girls to sexual harassment, assault, and murder. We note that the Highway of Tears bus was finally introduced in 2018, and while it was a step in the right direction, much more work needs to be done to address transit scarcity. Irene from Bella Coola says, I rely on our local community bus service. However, our transportation service out of our rural, remote valley to connect with Williams Lake and beyond is nil. I am not able to visit friends and relatives, and as a senior citizen, I require dental, medical, and eye appointments, which are all on hold without a reliable transportation network. From Tara in the Comox Valley, public transit in the Comox Valley has improved over the years, but is still poor. Lack of evening, weekend, and holiday service is especially problematic here. Car culture is very strong, which is detrimental to our environment and, of course, to our kids. We need a campaign to get people out of their cars and onto buses or microbuses, something that makes public transit popular, easy, and affordable. And finally, from Cynthia in Nelson. There are no longer direct flights east. There is only an expensive private bus leaving from the Kootenays. I recently took it from Calgary. The rusting, mechanically unsound bus with a non-professional driver who wore headphones while driving, a bus that only produced heat for the bus when running, but not moving, a bus with no washroom, broke down. These stories, and more like them, have been coming to us from all over British Columbia. We hope this gives you some idea of the challenges facing public transit in BC, and that this report signals a new emphasis on public transit. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'm glad that we could have that, hear those words from Sharon with Let's Ride BC, and I think that really opens up this session in a really important way as a reminder again about the very specific needs and priorities of different communities throughout BC, particularly those in rural and remote areas. I'm going to pass it right over to Marc to share some highlights from his report.
Okay, thank you, Emiko, and I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, thanks, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be able to have the chance to talk to you today about the report that we published. I want to note that this was a partnership with the BC Federation of Labor. They are looking at the public transit plan as a key plank of their climate and jobs strategy. So it was really exciting to be able to work with them. We engaged with a number of the key union partners in the BC Federation of Labor and a whole bunch of other transportation experts in and outside of government. I mean, first of all, I just want to give a shout out to Eric Doherty, who invited me to be here today and has been a real leader on transportation policy and worked with us on our climate justice project. And he's been doing some really incredible work and is a phenomenal resource to the movement. And I also see that Todd Littman is on the call as well. And Todd, with his Victoria Transport Policy Institute, is an incredible resource of detail, summarizing all of the empirical research that you need to know about all things to do with transportation and transit. So we have some greats among us here today. I also just feel like coming into this meeting with a bit of a heavy heart. I mean, some of the news or just over the last week or two, we are in a very tragic moment with what's happening in Latin America with extreme heat and the flooding in southern Brazil, in Africa, in Asia. We're seeing temperature records tumble by huge margins day by day. And even though we have a patch of nice weather settling in over British Columbia, right now, we know the drought that we are seeing is going to lead to a very smoky and fire-filled summer. So the idea that this is a climate emergency really needs to be put a front burner and needs to be really shaping our overall approach, not just on transportation, but on buildings and industry and so forth. So having said that, let's dive right in. There was a reality show from England, from the BBC, called Race Across the World. And last year, their whole season was about a race across Canada. In episode 1, they had to get from Stanley Park up to Tallel. Now, it was a kind of a constrained thing. There were limitations on their ability to use cell phones and how much money they had available on them. But basically, all of them found that once they got a couple hours outside of Metro Vancouver, they hit a dead end. That was whether they went to Vancouver Island, up the sea to sky to Whistler, or down the main highway to Hope in the Valley. There's really nowhere else they could get to on public transit. They needed to pay for rides or hitch rides and all of that. So that was part of my thinking going into this was, if you've traveled and been to Japan or Europe, you show up at the airport, you get on transit, and you never think of needing to rent a car to get what you're doing because the infrastructure exists and it's efficient and it's reliable. And what would that look like in British Columbia? So that was a really big overarching question of mine. And I take a personal interest in it because I don't own a private automobile. So the good news is that there's a lot to build on in British Columbia. There's a lot of planning work at the provincial level and also at the local level. BC Transit works with local governments and some regional governments to develop these transit future action plans, which set out the pathway for new routes that they want to bring in and schedules and how that's all going to work. There's higher level regional planning that takes place provincially in Metro Vancouver, where I live. There's very advanced planning work being done by TransLink and are already implementing all of these things. So to some extent, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel here. It was much more about investing in these pieces, accelerating them, and then connecting them all together into a more seamless whole. So what does that look like? I mean, first of all, simply recognizing that transit is a lifeline for a large segment of the population, and that we need to start thinking about mobility as a human right. So obviously there are large sections of the population who cannot drive or who choose not to drive or are limited financially in terms of their ability to drive. That's only going to become more acute over time due to an aging population. And in particular, in the north and the interior of the province, access to healthcare is a really key driver of demand for transportation and transit, but also education, getting to work, getting to see family. So at a base level, there's a core constituency that needs transit. Secondly, we think there's a lot of potential for induced demand. That is, if you build it, it will come. And I'm looking to Todd Littman here because of his great work on this particular point that people will choose transit over cars if it makes good sense for them, if it is reliable and frequent, and you can essentially close the gap in terms of time and convenience with cars. So we think that if we build out the system that we would like to see, there's a lot of people sitting on the sidelines who would really jump at the chance of being able to use a more effective and efficient system like that. Key to that is, the overall experience, of course, adding some better electronic features like Wi-Fi on buses and trains, real-time information displays, so you know when the next bus is coming, seamless interconnection across systems as well. Right now, even though the main agencies we're talking about in BC are TransLink, BC Ferries, and BC Transit, even when it comes to BC Transit, there's sort of like separate transit systems that they negotiate with local governments. So if you wanted to go from Chilliwack to Sechelt, you're looking at essentially crossing 4 different transit systems. Of course, we're talking about a climate emergency and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, really key and need in terms of where we are in the current moment. And I think that, when a lot of the modeling happens around climate and greenhouse gas emissions, that public transit doesn't model very well in those. That it's much more about a shift from internal combustion engine cars to electric ones. So our ability to model the impacts of public transit is very limited in those models. And I think as a result, in government policy, we are not seeing the emphasis on public transit that it should when it comes to reducing transportation emissions. We know that even if we're replacing trips by car in a standard diesel bus, then it's still a benefit relative to everyone driving their own vehicle. And the BC government has set out plans to develop a clean transportation action plan. And a lot of what I've read so far mostly talks about walking and cycling, which is great. I bike for most of my trips, but has really downplayed a transit, and we think that it needs to be a much more central part of all of that. A benefit of doing this is that the inflation experience that we've seen over the last few years, a big chunk of that has to do with the spikes in oil prices, which show up at the pumps. So doing the right thing by the climate also helps to insulate us from those type of external shocks. Double articulated bus, I threw this in there just because Eric Doherty is on the call, and he's been such a fan of this model. And electric connected to the overhead wires. It's funny because in Metro Vancouver through TransLink we have this electric bus network, and we don't really pat ourselves on the back enough for the low GHG form that takes. And this is essentially the next generation of those. Larger capacity, not quite the size of like LRT, but much higher capacity and great as a kind of a backbone to the transit systems we're looking at. Also on climate is more than just reducing the particular emissions from vehicles is how transit investments can help shape the overall growth and development patterns in our society. So we love this idea of complete communities, the idea that you should be able to walk or bike or take a short transit trip for all of the key needs you have in your life, whether that's getting to work, accessing public services, shopping, parks, and other amenities. And we're already seeing new housing density plans being tabled by the province. This is a beneficial thing overall. But I don't see a commensurate discussion right now around expanding the transit infrastructure to be able to handle all of that new density. So even if you think of pre-COVID, the backlogs on TransLink systems were already pretty huge, and if we start to stack more and more density on there, then we need much more expansion of the transit system to keep everybody moving. We think the BC government can also play a key role in this through its strategic investments. We need more community health centers. We need more seniors residences. We need other kind of anchor tenant things, not just another Safeway, but public services tied to these transit-oriented development investments we're talking about now. Another big piece in all of this is that, as we push towards a more coherent, seamless public system, we can eliminate areas of privatization in the transportation system. So, since the pullout of Greyhound in 2018, there's kind of a patchwork of private services, if they exist at all, for various inter-community travel, but it's very it's not coordinated in any kind of consistent manner. Even within the public system of what we do with BC Transit, these are largely contracts, except for a few places like Victoria. These are contracted out to multinational companies, and this has adverse impacts on workers in terms of pay and benefits. And it also limits our ability to create a more coherent system that's seamless across all those different dimensions that we talked about. We've also seen this manifest in recruitment and retention issues and transit strikes over the last few years. So we think there's a lot of potential to just have a more coherent public system in all of this. And bringing work back within the public sector is going to be good for workers overall. And we also, of course, as noted at the beginning, we need to recognize the First Nations rights and title, and that a lot of the transportation investments in the past essentially ran roughshod over those title and rights. Particularly in northern BC and in the interior, the lack of transit options is a huge safety issue for those communities, as the Let's Ride video was pointing out, very clearly. So we want new transit development, but it has to be consistent with free, prior, and informed consent for First Nations and Indigenous people. And if we do that, I think there's a lot of potential to bring development and reconciliation in terms of that historical relationship and those historical injustices. To get there, we need BC government leadership. That, the type of plan we're talking about requires negotiation with private railways, local and regional governments, with First Nations. The BC government is really the only entity that can address all of those legal and regulatory challenges in a consistent manner. Particularly where you have those, like I was mentioning before, where you're crossing these jurisdictional boundaries, going from TransLink to BC Ferries to BC Transit. And we think that, with clear direction, multi-year funding, this is something that local governments and regional districts have been asking for, is these kind of clear multi-year commitments that will allow them to make the investments that they need. So we think that BC Transit is a unique agency in Canada. It's doing a lot of good things, but its current service plan doesn't plan for a whole lot of growth. And so I think we need to push more strongly to leverage those existing investments and new ones on top of that to build through BC Transit. So what's our 10-year investment plan look like? First of all, we want to connect BC communities everywhere. I mean, you should be able to get from almost anywhere to almost anywhere else in British Columbia on transit with a minimal penalty in terms of convenience vis-a-vis cars. This is significant for improving mobility around the province, getting people to where they need to get to. And also, I think there's a benefit in terms of tourism. We've seen some of the plans in the northern and interior with smaller communities and First Nations seeing potential tourism opportunities by making it easier for people to get there. Big part of our plan is just to double the number of buses in the BC Transit local services, doing that within 5 years and tripling it within 10. Basically trying to get to a place where we have frequent, reliable local transit services that people can count on to get where they need to get to and back home. I think there's also a lot of potential to do that, the first mile, last mile challenge through more customized services. So not necessarily everything has to be in a larger bus, but there are community shuttle services, very sort of on-demand applications, car sharing, bike sharing that can really supplement those. On the Sunshine Coast, we're already seeing some examples of this that really help build out their local transit network. Coastal Rides, transit hailing. And whoever's got their mic on, can you mute it? Because it's annoying me. And the Coast Car Sharing Co-op as well, which is connected to the Moto car sharing here in Metro Vancouver. Metro Vancouver is pioneering a new integrated RideLink app. I volunteered to test it out, and they haven't gotten back to me yet, but I'm really hoping that I get the email soon that I get to test this one out. And then there's some really interesting, examples from the United States and other parts of the world where they're doing more like connections from the kind of endpoint of the main transit line to something that's a bit more custom. It's not necessarily door to door, but block to block, and other things that we can learn from and steal here in BC. So a lot of, 80% of the population of British Columbia lives in the South Coast and Vancouver Island. So a lot of investments are concentrated there. In terms of TransLink, the provincial government has already notionally committed to 40% of that plan. So we're saying that we should just accelerate that $6.8 billion is what it turns out to be in the next 5 years. And then add on another $4 billion to accelerate rapid transit options across the region. Also, just kind of being a bit critical here of the funding model, the idea that everything has to be cost shared between the federal government, provincial government, and regional or local governments. We don't think that needs to be the case. And certainly that's not the case when we build out highway or freeway infrastructure around the province. Often that is 100% financed by the provincial government. And there's a strong case to get ahead of the curve on this stuff for the provincial government to do that as well. We already did that with the Millennium Line, for example. So we shouldn't trap ourselves in artificial funding arrangements. We also think there's a lot of potential to build out on historical rail corridors for that sort of commuter rail, regional rail dimension that you see in Toronto or New York or the Bay Area, also on Vancouver Island. And passenger ferry options as another way of thinking about BC ferries. We saw major crunches in terms of capacity last year with BC ferries. BC Ferries still seems to be in the mindset of being an extension of the highway system as a means of transporting cars from one place to the other. But a lot of the passenger traffic already is passenger only. And if we had dedicated new passenger ferry options, we could really interconnect Vancouver, the Gulf Islands, Sunshine Coast, Vancouver Island. We also need to expand Handy Dart service province-wide. And I think the overall, and most of what we talk about are capital investments, but also on the operating side, it's important that the provincial government step up. TransLink has certainly been making this case. We do provide public operating subsidies via BC Ferries and BC Transit, and to a limited extent to TransLink for the free transit under age 12. But we are arguing that the current amount of about $300 million should be something more like $1.5 billion by year 10 of our plan, given the expansion that we are talking about. That would allow us to do things like expand the realm of free transit up to age 18. It would allow us to provide free transit for people on social assistance, personally, I'm a big fan of the idea of free transit overall, but in this particular report, we didn't go full all the way on that one, but mostly focusing on, where can we expand the realm of free transit in the short term. But as a longer term objective, I'm all over the free transit, and then sort of integrating all of these pieces into something more seamless and connected and coherent. A lot of text so far. Showing you a few pictures. One of the illustrators working with the BC Federation, Angela, worked with me to try to develop some transit-like maps of what we were talking about. This isn't necessarily a specific proposal in terms of particular routes and all of that. This one was based on the Southern Interior Transportation Plan and just turned it into something more funky. Similarly, if we think about extensions out into the Fraser Valley, this one on the bottom part shows repurposing the old interurban line out to Abbotsford and then to Chilliwack. Ideally, there'd probably be a bunch more stops along the way in there. And similarly, on the top part, we have the West Coast Express. We'd love to make that 7 days a week and all day, not just a commuter service. And then expanding from its current terminus in Mission to Abbotsford, where I think the original plan for West Coast Express was. We did this during the Olympics. It worked really well, and we could do it again. It's going to take a little bit of negotiation with the railways, but I think we put a little bit of money on the table, allow some double tracking in key pinch points, that type of thing, then I think we can get there. And then similarly with the passenger ferries, these are not necessarily, again, showing particular pathways through the Gulf Islands, but mostly just to give you a sense of what the potential could be in terms of these connections. Similarly on Vancouver Island, this is a transportation investment area that the provincial government has been looking at, but it's sort of mired in provincial, federal, and some very important Indigenous First Nations challenges. So again, this is one of the areas where there's a lot of potential for economic development for local First Nations and reconciliation and to develop this piece of the transit system, which I think would be fantastic for Vancouver Island. We're going to spend a lot of money on this. It's going to create a lot of jobs, about 16,800 jobs per year on the construction side of things. And then we need people to operate these things. It's about 23,700 jobs per year in the operations once these get up and built. There's a cost to this, of course, so we advance the $6.8 billion that the provincial government has already notionally committed, and then we pile on with a $15.4 billion of capital expenditures to build out the network that we were talking about. We just tried to profile that a little bit of what it would look like over a 10-year period. Now, all of that's a lot of money, particularly for you and I on this call, but you have to remember that transportation is subsidized in every which way, whether you're driving your car or taking the bus. We subsidize transit, and we should just sort of recognize that. The $22 billion over 10 years compares pretty favorably to what we're already spending in transportation capital expenditures. So about $13.5 billion in the current 3-year capital plan. There's a chunk of that's for transit, which is good, but mostly this is the expansion of SkyTrain and Metro Vancouver. It doesn't really get to the other type of stuff that we're talking about. But look at it another way. We spend $10 billion on new vehicles every year, and if we can get a household that can get rid of their car or get rid of one of their cars, that can save anywhere from $6,000 to $10,000 per year. So we think that people are already spending the money. It's just about how we spend the money and doing it in a way that's smarter, that meets our greenhouse gas targets, that meets our mobility targets, and that helps address some of the major congestion issues that we're seeing in transit. All right, I've talked too much. Thank you so much for your attention. If you want to be part of the campaign that the BC Federation of Labour is running, and if you want to check out the full report, in all of its detail, check the link down below. And I will stop there and pass it back to Emiko. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark. That was really informative. If folks do want to take a look at the full report, I think Laura put it in the chat earlier. Maybe she can drop it in there again. All of that sounds like a no-brainer to me after hearing you walk us through it, Mark. So now it's just a question of getting our elected leaders on board. I'm gonna pass it right over to our next testimonial. This is going to be Anjali from Transit for Teens. Anjali is a sophomore at UBC, pursuing a degree in sociology and gender, race, sexuality, and social justice. Her early engagement in sustainability initiatives, from climate justice to lake revival projects, reflects her dedication to creating a fairer and greener future. She's excited about the Transit for Teens initiative with the Center for Family Equity and sees it as a chance to address social disparities and combat climate change through equitable transportation access. She also aims to advocate for inclusive solutions that prioritize marginalized youth, fostering a more just and environmentally conscious society.
Thank you, Emiko. That was wonderful. Really appreciate that. I'm with the Center for Family Equity, and one of the things we're working on currently is a Transit for Teens program, which is an extension of the Get On Board program, which here in BC means that children or people from the age of 0 to 12 have free transit. And as of now, we're looking to get that extended to 18. And the kind of thought process behind this is that from like a public health perspective, or from a social justice perspective, or even from a climate justice perspective, free transit ensures that financial constraints do not become barriers to young people's success and well-being, and that by removing the cost barrier, we're enabling teens to attend school regularly, to access tutoring, to participate in extracurricular activities, and access vital resources like food banks without worrying about transportation expenses. At-risk youth especially need transit to secure the resources such as housing, food security, and safety that they need to stabilize their lives. And the barrier-free access to transit is just that ticket that they need to end their mobility poverty. More than that, public transportation is also inherently environmentally friendly, and it reduces car travel. And when you have younger people integrated into the practice of using transit earlier, they're more likely to use it as they, grow older. And the more people we incentivize to use transit, the more funding we get from the government, and the more funding we get from the government, the better transit systems we have, which kind of is just like this cycle that just feeds itself. And so we're just hoping that through this initiative, we have more people using transit systems, and that we can get more people on board. And we see the better effects of free and fair transit in BC. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Anjali. And also thanks to Emily for being here as well, who is also with Transit for Teens. Such important ideas you brought up there, Anjali, and especially the idea of if we can get youth hooked on public transportation from an early age, then hopefully they'll just, continue that practice as they grow older. I'm going to pass it right along to our next speaker. Just want to remind folks that if you have questions for any of our speakers, put them right into the chat. Next, we're going to hear from Eric Doherty, who again is a transportation planner, consultant, and lead of the BC Climate Emergency Campaign's Transportation Working Group.
Thank you. I'm just going to try to get my presentation up here. Okay, I want to start off by talking about the context for this globally, which is that the world scientists, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has identified that transformative change in the transportation sector is needed to meet climate targets. That's the climate science. Just focusing on electric cars won't cut it. Slow incremental change won't cut it. And both of what the Connecting BC report focuses on and what the BC Climate Emergency Campaign is doing, both acknowledge this urgency and the science behind it. Over 575 groups have endorsed the 10 actions, our open letter from the BC Climate Emergency Campaign. And the point 8, the accelerate the transition to zero emissions transportation. These 2 points are about investing in affordable, accessible, and convenient public transit and reallocating funds. The first one overlaps quite well with what's in the Connecting BC report. We really emphasize this point of the need to invest in public transit between communities, not just within communities. Same thing for the top point for Connecting BC, and obviously focusing on doubling the number of buses so quickly. That really matches the urgency. And I want to just sort of emphasize that there is the potential for a highway bus service that to be implemented quickly that's better and more affordable than Greyhound ever was. Because I know that some of you, are thinking back to Greyhound and, thinking, gee, I wish we still had that, but also remembering that it wasn't that great. Yeah, reallocating infrastructure funds from highway expansion to transit. That's really high on our what we're focusing on in the 10-point open letter that over 575 groups have endorsed, and the Connecting BC report echoes that. That a big way that we can fund all this great public transit is by stopping wasting money on highway expansion. And we even got a comic book about this from Amnesty International that I worked on. And Samira and Andy, really lay it out. It's that we are living in a situation where governments are continuing to prioritize highway expansion, even when it does things like take away space from elementary and high schools. And we can recognize that widening highways makes traffic worse. It increases greenhouse gas pollution. And governments are promising climate action, but not really following through. After we'd done the BC Climate Emergency Campaign open letter in 2021, there was an opportunity to comment on the BC government's proposed Clean Action Transportation Plan. In March 2023, we put together an open letter that was signed by 75 organizations. A big focus of that was on the BC government's target of reducing vehicle kilometers traveled 25% by 2030. This is actually an even stronger target than California has set. This is an absolute target, whereas California has set a target of 25% by 2030, but that's a per capita target. And I think it's worth emphasizing that vehicle kilometer or vehicle mile traveled reduction targets are becoming the standard option to consider in climate action planning. Pretty much every jurisdiction that is serious about climate has these targets. And the question is, are they taking serious action to meet them or not? Yeah, the overlap is really strong here. It focuses on we focus on the vehicle kilometers travel target. And so does the Connecting BC report. And I think, and there's also a really good overlap on how to achieve this. Both our letter and the Clean BC plan emphasizing reallocating road space to things like bus lanes, transit lanes, protected bike and roll lanes in the connection of in the case of the climate emergency campaign. And I think that it's kind of worthwhile recognizing that the science behind this is actually really simple. You can put it together in a little cartoon illustration like this one. 50 people on a road in cars takes up a lot of space. 50 people on a road in a bus doesn't even fill one bus. A standard bus has a comfortable capacity of around 55, 60 people. And yeah, so one bus lane is like 5 car lanes if you've got the buses to operate in it. And both of these reports, both of the letter and the report really focus on traffic evaporation, which is just the technical name for saying that when you provide good alternatives to driving, people use them. It's just that simple. It has this fancy name, traffic evaporation, but it's just that people make choices. And both of them actually use the same sources. This is a really great article in the CityFix blog on traffic evaporation. Focuses on how it just happens normally, how it breaks people's habits that wouldn't have been broken otherwise and aren't broken by things like tolls. And it's a sustainable and equitable way of improving mobility, and you get really nice parks out of it. This is my own article on traffic evaporation, and just emphasizing that it is an effective way of meeting these targets. And yeah, the front page picture is of a electric battery trolley bus operating in a busway. We've got some really good local examples coming out too. Vancouver's Climate Emergency Action Plan calls for reallocating 11% of road space. Present council isn't really following through, but we've got that on the books. There's also a strong overlap in the focus on equity for non-drivers. And we call for an actual equity lens and nothing about us without us approach, including the focus on seniors and people with disabilities who don't drive. Very similar statements in Connecting BC and a lot more detail. We, in our open letter, we actually use the example of the fact that the present Motor Vehicle Act and the associated regulations don't allow people using wheelchairs and mobility scooters the right to use all ages and abilities bike and roll routes. And we just point out that that simple change, basically a zero cost change, could make a big difference for a fair number of people in this province. Connecting BC focuses on Handy Dart service, which is a really crucial issue. And I want to give a shout out to the Save Our Handy Dart campaign, which a lot of really great people doing really good work on that. You can find out more at saveourhandydart.ca. And I also want to give a shout out to Greater Victoria Acting Together, which is one of the local groups working to change the law and allow, make sure that wheelchairs and mobility scooters are welcomed on bike and roll routes. And I showed you a couple of scenes from a comic earlier, and I just want to show you where this came from. I did some work, both the background policy work and working with the artist on this, as a way of explaining some of the key issues. And if you actually look at the final spread in this comic book, there's a lot of things that you'll see illustrated here that are talked about in Connecting BC and in our open letter. We've got the road space reallocated to bus lanes, to bike and roll lanes. We've got mobility scooters in the bike and roll lanes. And we've got a quiet, pleasant public space. And that's what I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, so much. Amazing all the work you've been doing and all your advocacy. I'm going to pass it immediately on to our next speaker because we're running a little bit behind here. So our third testimonial, we're very lucky to have Chantel joining us. Chantel is a paraplegic who has relied on a manual wheelchair since 2012. Born on Haida Gwaii, 27-year-old Chantel now lives in Vancouver, where she depends on the accessibility that the city offers wheelchair users. Over to you, Chantel.
Hello. So I'm here to just talk about the expansion of the bike and rollway paths for wheelchair users, which I think is really important because it can be a safety thing as well as a convenience thing. Nowadays, the technology for people with wheelchairs is moving forwards. We're seeing a lot more like powered mobility connections that are added on to manual chairs. We're seeing faster scooters. These things can go like up to 30 kilometers an hour, some of them. They're like small motorbikes. So they're not really safe to be using on a busy sidewalk, but also sidewalk is not really safe for a fast moving wheelchair either. They're often poorly kept, with lumps and bumps, and they're older, and it's just generally safer and preferable for a lot of people to be using the bike and roll paths. And I generally see most people in wheelchairs will just choose to use them. I wasn't even aware that technically we weren't allowed to be on there until Eric told me, because I've just always preferred to use it. It's a lot smoother, it's a lot safer. For myself, I use my service dog to help with my mobility, and when he is pulling me, we're moving at a good clip faster than the average walker. And very recently, going along the sidewalk, I hit a tiny little, it was like maybe half an inch, maybe an inch at the most, like lift between one pavement and the next. And I was completely flung out of my wheelchair. I fell on the ground. I hurt myself. My wheelchair nearly rolled into traffic. And if I was traveling on a bike path, that wouldn't have happened because they're smoother and better kept than pavements. There's also a lot of older parts of Vancouver where it's either like cobbles or really like the old sidewalks don't have curb cuts, and you're actually forced to travel on the bike and roll pathways whether you like it or not, because you either can't get on or off of the sidewalk. So I really support having this expansion to include people using wheelchairs and mobility aids in these bike and roll paths, because it makes life safer for us and just easier when it's already so hard. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Chantel, for sharing your personal experience, and really sorry to hear about your accident. I hope you're doing okay.
I've recovered.
Good.
Just a little more terrible now.
Yeah, that's really scary. So I'm glad you're doing okay. And great to have your personal testimony included. We're coming up to the end of the webinar, and I just want to pose one question, thanks to those who have been putting your questions in the chat, and I see a number of them are being answered. I want to pose one question. I don't know if Eric or Marc would want to speak to this, but essentially you've done all this hard work putting together this report. What comes next? Someone asked, what steps are being taken to pressure parties to make a commitment to this plan in advance of the election? So can you talk really quickly about what are some next steps?
I'll start. Yeah, I mean, as noted earlier, the BC Federation of Labor is coordinating a campaign around the Connecting BC report ideas. They've been meeting with politicians and senior civil servants in Victoria, talking about these ideas, wanting to really get this on the agenda with the provincial election coming up in mid-October. So I think it's a really key, important moment to be having those conversations. And for me, it's really a thrill to be kind of working and doing a report in partnership with a campaign, because sometimes we do work and we kind of put it out there and that's where it ends. So I think it's a great opportunity. I'd encourage folks at the organizational level to connect with the campaign. Trish Garner, the BC Federation, has been doing a really incredible job on all of this, and you can connect with them for further steps.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think that's a really great initiative of the BC Federation of Labor. I sort of feel like I should have started out by thanking them, and how important it is not only that they funded this report, but they're doing the work and lending their respectability, their name to this initiative. And I think the answer to that is that there's also a lot of local groups, some of them here who have been putting their contact information into the chat. There's Let's Ride. And I'd like to invite anyone who's interested to, from those groups, but also individuals who have an interest in helping with coordination, to join the BC Climate Emergencies Transportation Working Group. And you can just do that by contacting me by email. I'll put my email in the chat.
Thanks, Eric. Maybe Marc, you could also put your email if you're willing. And I see a question in the chat about the BC Fed campaign and how folks can contact somebody there. We're at the end. I'm gonna just take 1 minute quickly for some final action items for folks. So as Eric mentioned, if any of you are not already involved with the BC Climate Emergency Campaign, many of you are, but if you're not, I would really encourage you to get your organization to sign on to our 10 actions and become a signatory. Would love to have your involvement. Or if you're not a part of an organization, if you could send out the call to folks that you know in your networks who would want to be involved, that would be amazing. We have a transportation working group, but there's no, you don't have to commit to joining that working group specifically. If that's not possible for you, you can just sign on to join our list of signatories. And the biggest thing that we want to do now in the lead up to October is making climate a part of the election. So we need to be having these conversations with the people in our lives. We need to be calling in to radio shows and making it a part of the conversation. We need to be writing letters to the editor. We need to be doing everything that we can to make sure that climate is a central part of this discourse in the lead up to October. So that's our ask. Would encourage you to hopefully take some next steps following this, either get involved with the BC CEC, get involved with Transit for Teens, reach out to Marc, reach out to the BC Federation of Labor, and continue to do the great work that I'm sure all of you are doing. Thank you so much for being here. We will be sending out the recording after. I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.